I concluded my talk yesterday by saying that although there's a great deal of geological evidence that's consistent with a worldwide flood, we also need to address a number of geological challenges. In today's talk, I want to address one of those challenges, namely the claim that wind-blown desert sandstones in the supposedly flood-deposited portion of the stratigraphic record falsify the idea of a worldwide flood. Our focus is going to be on the lower Permian Coconino Sandstone of Arizona, which is one of the classic textbook examples of an aeolian or wind-deposited sandstone in the stratigraphic record. The Coconino is one of the most prominent cliff-forming units in Arizona's Grand Canyon, but it also crops out across much of northern and central Arizona. It's a typically white or cream-coloured quartz-rich sandstone, and besides some vertebrate and invertebrate tracks, it doesn't contain any fossils. In the Grand Canyon, the Coconino is about 90 metres thick, but it thins to the north and to the west, and it thickens to the south, reaching about 300 metres thick near Pine, Arizona. The most conspicuous feature of the Coconino is its large-scale cross-bedding. Outcrops typically display sets of inclined layers or crossbeds, each up to 20 metres thick. Crossbeds like these are produced by the downcurrent migration of large sand dunes. The dunes migrate when sand is eroded from the upcurrent side of the dune and transported to the crest of the dune, from where it avalanches down the downcurrent side of the dune. In effect, the sloping crossbeds represent the former position of the advancing face of the sand dune. Work by Dr. John Whitmore has shown that the Coconino is part of a widespread blanket of sand that extends across much of the western United States. The Coconino can be correlated with other sandstone formations from southern California to North Dakota and from Texas to Idaho, covering an area of about 2.4 million square kilometres. In New Mexico and Texas, the sandstone is known as the Glorieta, in Colorado as the Lion Sandstone, and in Utah as the Weber Sandstone. But all of these sandstones are lateral equivalents of the Coconino and have many similar features. Geologists have been studying the Coconino Sandstone since the early years of the 20th century. It was originally named by Darton in 1910 after outcrops in Coconino County, Arizona. However, it's best known for the outcrops in the Grand Canyon region and south of Flagstaff. In 1934, the famous Grand Canyon geologist Edwin McKee published a major monograph about the Coconino Sandstone that became the standard work on the subject. A number of geologists, including McKee, also published a number of shorter papers about the Coconino, including studies of the fossil trackways and crossbeds. Several major papers about the stratigraphy of the Pennsylvanian and Permian rocks of the Colorado Plateau, including the Coconino, have been written by geologist Ron Blakey. And in 2003, all of this work was summed up in the second edition of the standard text on Grand Canyon geology. Now, in his 1934 monograph, Edwin McKee proposed that the Coconino had been deposited as windblown or aeolian dunes in an ancient desert, and that quickly became the geological consensus. The primary features said to support an aeolian origin for the Coconino are as follows. The Coconino is said to have high-angle cross-bedding, with dips close to the angle of repose, similar to those found in modern desert sand dunes. The Coconino sand is said to be composed of well-sorted and well-rounded grains, just like those found in modern deserts. And the sand grain surfaces are said to have been frosted by mechanical abrasion, consistent with wind transport in a desert environment. Moreover, the Coconino is said to lack grains of mica, a soft mineral easily abraded by harsh desert winds. In addition, there are evidences of subaerial exposure, such as desiccation cracks at the base of the formation. And there are fossilised vertebrate and invertebrate tracks said to resemble those made by animals walking around on loose, dry sand. So let's think about the problem that the Coconino presents for young-age flood geology. Although there's considerable debate among creationists about the location of the flood post-flood boundary in the geological record, most creationists think that the Paleozoic and Mesozoic rock layers were deposited during the worldwide flood. But when we look at the stack of sedimentary rock formations that occur across northern Arizona, as you can see here in this slide, we notice that the Coconino Sandstone is right in the middle of these flood layers. And of course, it's almost impossible to imagine how a major wind-blown sand deposit could have accumulated in the middle of a worldwide flood. So it's not surprising that critics of creationism, both Christian and non-Christian, have claimed that the Coconino Sandstone presents a major difficulty for flood geology. For example, in 1980, Christopher Weber, writing in a humanist journal, said, "You don't need a PhD in geology to know that desert dunes and other desert deposits do not form under roaring floodwaters. These require not only time, but also dry land. The flood of Noah supplies neither." And the geologist Arthur Strahler wrote in 1987, "The evidence of subaerial origin of the dune sand formations is undisputed as to its significance by mainstream geology. In itself, it is sufficiently weighty to totally discredit the biblical story of the flood of Noah as a naturalistic phenomenon occurring in 1 year." And in 2016, this beautifully produced book was published by a group of Christian and non-Christian geologists, seeking to persuade the Christian public of the evidence against flood geology. It was widely promoted by both Christian and secular organisations, and was endorsed by a number of well-known Bible scholars, including Wayne Grudem, Paul Copan, and Jack Collins. Once again, the authors appealed to the Coconino Sandstone as a central plank in their case for an old Earth. In fact, many of the claims that these authors make about the Coconino are ones that we'll be looking at in some detail in this talk. So how have creationists responded to this challenge? The first to embark upon a serious reinvestigation of the Coconino Sandstone was Dr. Leonard Brand, a professor in the Department of Earth and Biological Sciences at Loma Linda University in California. Back in the 1970s, he began to do some work on the fossil vertebrate tracks in the Coconino, work that he's continued to the present day. As you can see from the photograph on the right-hand side, many of these fossil vertebrate trackways are very well preserved, with fine details present, including toe and sole marks. In the 1940s, Edwin McKee had undertaken some sand trough experiments with various types of reptiles, from which he'd concluded that the fossil tracks in the Coconino had been made by animals walking around on loose, dry sand, perhaps dampened by mist or dew. However, in 1979, Leonard Brand reported the results of new laboratory experiments involving 236 trackways made by living amphibians and reptiles in laboratory tanks. His experiments included a wider range of conditions than those employed by McKee, with tracks made on dry sand, moist sand, wet sand and submerged sand, and on a variety of different slopes. Brand also made detailed observations of 82 fossil trackways along the Hermit Trail in Grand Canyon. He noted that in the fossil trackways, individual prints were usually distinct and separate, some displaying toe marks only, some sole impressions only, and some both toe and sole impressions. Moreover, he found that almost all of the fossil trackways were made by animals that were moving upslope. Brand compared his observations of the experimental trackways with the fossil trackways. He found that fewer than 12% of the experimental tracks made in dry sand or damp sand displayed toe marks or other fine details, compared with more than 80% of the fossil tracks, underwater tracks, and wet sand tracks. Moreover, the proportions of the fossil tracks were quite different from those made in dry sand, but were similar to those made underwater or in wet sand. However, he also noted some features that were consistently observed in the wet sand tracks, but which were notably absent from the fossil tracks. And so he concluded that the fossil tracks in the Coconino most closely resembled the tracks in his experiments that had been made underwater. There were other features of the Coconino tracks that favoured an underwater origin too. For example, the rarity of downslope tracks seemed to be best explained by animals that were spending most of their time swimming with the water current, but walking on the bottom when they were moving against the current. And in 1991, Leonard Brand published descriptions of several trackways with features that were hard to explain unless the track makers had been buoyed up by water. For example, there were trackways in which the individual footprints were pointing in a different direction to the trackway itself, suggesting that the animal making them had been drifting sideways under the influence of a current. Other trackways started or ended abruptly without any evidence that slumping of sand had obscured them, which could be explained if the track makers were being picked up and set down by a water current. As a result of Leonard Brand's careful research over a number of decades, we can now say that the Coconino trackways are no longer incontrovertible evidence of an aeolian environment, and in fact have many features that seem to point to an underwater origin. What about the invertebrate trackways, which have tended to get much less attention? Researchers in the 1930s and 1940s carried out experiments with modern animals such as scorpions and spiders, and noted that the trackways they made on dry or damp sand resembled some of the invertebrate trackways in the Coconino. However, these experiments also showed that different animals could produce very similar tracks, and that conversely, the same kind of animal could produce many different types of tracks under different conditions. And several authors have noted the resemblance of some of the Coconino trackways to the tracks made by various types of marine invertebrates, suggesting that experiments with a wider range of organisms, including perhaps marine and freshwater animals, might be interesting. Also, Leonard Brand has recently been working with one of his students on new invertebrate trackway experiments, once again employing a wider range of conditions than those used in the earlier studies, and it will be very interesting to see what results they come up with. Well, so far we've been thinking about the fossil trackways, but in recent years creationists have also been working on other aspects of the Coconino problem. Dr. John Whitmore, Senior Professor of Geology at Cedarville University, began to do fieldwork on the Coconino as a graduate student in 1998. And between 2006 and 2012, he led a major research project on the Coconino, sponsored by the Institute for Creation Research. A number of others were involved in the project, including Ray Strom and myself. In fact, this was the first major field investigation of the Coconino since the work of Edwin McKee in the 1930s. In the course of our project, we visited a large number of Coconino outcrops throughout northern and central Arizona, including outcrops along every trail in the Grand Canyon that crosses the Coconino. We collected hundreds of rock samples for thin section work and for other laboratory analyses. We measured crossbed dips at most localities, and at some locations entire measured sections were made. We also studied other sandstones similar to the Coconino, though not as extensively, both in the southwestern United States and in Great Britain. Detailed petrographic studies were conducted on many of our samples to determine the sorting and rounding of the sand grains, the mineral composition and porosity. For comparative purposes, we also studied modern wind-blown sand dunes at more than 36 locations, and collected sand samples from different parts of the sand dunes at these sites. In addition, we made an effort to collect all of the relevant literature about the Coconino and its equivalents, and on modern desert dunes and underwater sand dunes. As our research progressed, we reported our findings at scientific meetings, including annual meetings of the Geological Society of America and the Creation Geology Society. And we wrote scientific papers that were published in both creationist and mainstream geological journals. One of the things we discovered is that despite confident claims in the literature about the sorting, rounding, frosting, and mineralogy of the Coconino sand grains, almost no petrographic work had ever been done on the Coconino. And so this became a major focus of our research in order to accurately characterize the Coconino's mineralogical and textural features. So let's take a look at some of the things we found. First of all, let's consider the sorting and rounding of the Coconino sand grains. A common claim that we encountered in the literature was that the Coconino is composed of well-sorted and well-rounded sand grains, just like those found in modern desert sands. In actual fact, it's something of a misconception that desert sands are particularly well-rounded. For example, one published study of nearly 22,000 sand grains from a large number of modern desert dunes found that they tended to be only sub-rounded rather than well-rounded. Nevertheless, our studies revealed that overall, the Coconino sand grains were more angular than those typically found in modern deserts. In order to do this petrographic work, more than 400 thin sections were prepared from rock samples taken from across the Coconino outcrop, and about 100 of those thin sections were used for detailed petrographic work. 400 to 600 sand grains were measured per slide, and then 300 of the grains randomly selected to generate the statistics. So a locality with 10 thin sections would be represented by 3,000 sand grains. Standard grain size and rounding categories were applied. So what did we find? Well, here you can see a map summarising the results of our rounding studies. The most rounded Coconino sand grains we found were at a place called Chino Point West, where they can be categorised as sub-rounded. The most angular Coconino sand grains we found were at Trail Canyon, where the sand grains can be categorised as subangular. So overall, the Coconino sand is best characterised as subangular to sub-rounded, not well-rounded as much of the literature claims. Here you can see the typical rounding of Coconino sand grains at a location called Whitmore Canyon. You'll notice the blue areas in the slide, which represent the pore spaces in the sandstone which have been filled with the epoxy resin used to fix the slide. The white sand grains are quartz grains, and the yellow grains are potassium feldspars. At this locality, the sand is characterised as angular to subangular. What about the sorting of the sand grains? Well, here you can see a map summarising the results of our Coconino sorting studies. The most poorly sorted Coconino samples occur in the northern part of the outcrop, and we discovered that sorting generally becomes better towards the south. The most well-sorted Coconino sand grains were found at a place called Cave Spring Campground, where they could be categorised as well-sorted. The most poorly sorted Coconino sand grains were at Jump Up Spring, where they were very poorly sorted. We found that overall the Coconino is best characterised as moderately to poorly sorted, and only occasionally well sorted, again, contrary to what's claimed in much of the literature. Here you can see the degree of sorting of the Coconino sand grains at a location called Andros Point. Again, the white grains are quartz, and the yellow grains are the feldspars. Notice the very poor sorting with very large grains and small grains in the same sample. Well, so much for sorting and rounding. Another feature that's often claimed to support the aeolian deposition of the Coconino is the frosting on the surfaces of the quartz sand grains. The sand grains in modern deserts often have a dull, white appearance as a result of the small pits and blemishes caused by grain collisions during wind transport. Now, usually it's only the larger sand grains that are frosted, because the smaller grains don't collide with one another with sufficient momentum to cause the surfaces to become frosted. Many authors have claimed that the Coconino sand grains are frosted in a manner similar to that of modern desert sands, and this is again said to be evidence that the Coconino was deposited by the wind. As a matter of fact, frosted sand grains don't necessarily prove a wind-blown origin. For example, sand grains can be frosted by wind transport, and then the sand later redeposited by water, in which case the frosting doesn't tell us anything about the last depositional environment of the sand. Also, we know that the frosting of sand grains can occur in environments other than deserts, and by processes other than wind transport. For example, sand grains can be frosted by chemical processes after they're deposited. In our searches of the literature, we discovered that nobody had published any scanning electron micrographs of the Coconino sand grains in order to try to clarify the origin of the frosting in the Coconino. And so again, this became a focus of our research. Here you can see a light microscope image of Coconino sand grains from Cave Spring Campground. The sandstone at this location wasn't very well lithified, so it was much easier to disaggregate the sandstone and to separate out the sand grains. Now you'll notice that most of the sand grains do have a frosted appearance. However, what we found is that it's not only the larger sand grains in the Coconino that are frosted. Generally speaking, the Coconino is quite fine sand, and it looks as though even the smaller sand grains are typically frosted. Now this is a significant observation, because the finer Coconino sand grains are too small to have been frosted extensively by grain collisions during wind transport. And this suggests that the frosting in the Coconino is more likely to have had a chemical origin than to be the result of mechanical abrasion. Here you can see some scanning electron micrographs of Coconino sand grains, this time from a location called Pine Creek Trail. Again, the grains have a frosted appearance, but the frosting is most probably the result of the chemical dissolution and reprecipitation of quartz. Sandstones like the Coconino, with a lot of pore space between the grains, are particularly susceptible to chemical attack of this kind, because groundwater can flow so easily through them, and we can see evidence of this in the Coconino samples we studied. So it seems that the frosting of the Coconino sand grains is in fact not good evidence of an aeolian depositional environment. Another surprising discovery we made during our petrographic studies concerns the mineral mica. Mica grains are composed of multiple thin sheets, and it's a very soft mineral compared to quartz, so mica grains tend to flake apart very easily. In fact, it's generally acknowledged in the literature that mica and other clay minerals break down very quickly in harsh desert environments. For example, Morehouse, in his textbook on the study of rocks in thin section, says that mica is absent in dune sands and other wind-deposited sands. And the sedimentary petrologist Tucker agrees that micas are easily removed from wind-blown sediments. Indeed, the absence of mica from the Coconino has been appealed to as further evidence of its aeolian origin. For example, in their book The Bible, Rocks and Time, geologists Davis Young and Ralph Stearley state that the Coconino and other aeolian sandstones contain no mica because the micas have been abraded to oblivion and or wafted off-site by wind. So imagine our surprise when, during our petrographic studies, we discovered mica grains in virtually every thin section we looked at. The mica in the Coconino is mostly in the form of muscovite or white mica. But under cross-polarized light, the mica flakes stand out in very bright colours, so they're quite easy to see. We discovered that mica occurs in trace amounts throughout the entire thickness of the Coconino and across the whole of its outcrop area, And you can see here just a few of our thin sections showing the often quite large mica grains. Now, I mentioned earlier that we'd also collected samples from a number of modern wind-blown sand dunes, including the Nebraska sandhills. Despite extensive searching, we were unable to find mica flakes in most of these samples, except where the sand dunes were relatively small and a crystalline rock source was nearby, a scenario that doesn't apply to the Coconino. Some of John Whitmore's students even tested the durability of mica in laboratory experiments, and they were able to confirm that mica grains rapidly deteriorated within about 4 days in simulated aeolian conditions, whereas they could last more than a year in subaqueous conditions. So we think that the presence of mica flakes throughout the Coconino is good evidence that it was deposited by water. Another surprising mineral that we discovered in our field and laboratory studies of the Coconino was dolomite. Dolomite is a magnesium-rich carbonate mineral, and we found it in various forms across about half of the Coconino outcrop, including in Grand Canyon. The dolomite occurs as individual grains, as a cement binding other grains together, as small coated grains called ooids with a distinctive concentric structure, and even as discrete beds within the sandstone. So what's the significance of finding dolomite in the Coconino? Well, although the formation of dolomite is still regarded as something of an enigma, its formation seems to require a number of conditions, including the presence of water and a steady supply of magnesium and carbonate ions. And it's hard to see how these conditions could be met in a desert, at least on any large scale. In fact, dolomite is usually regarded as a marine mineral, at least when it occurs in any significant quantity. Of the various forms of dolomite that we found, perhaps the most interesting are the dolomite beds and the dolomite ooids. We discovered dolomite beds at several localities. These discrete beds are typically several centimetres thick, and they can be traced more than 100 kilometres along the base of the formation in the northernmost part of the outcrop. And they consist of almost pure dolomite, up to 98%. Some have suggested that the dolomite beds might represent temporary ponds in between the sand dunes in the Coconino Desert. But that seems very inadequate to explain the purity of the dolomite and the regional extent of the beds. Also, we don't find any evaporative minerals associated with the dolomite, such as salt, as you might expect in an interdunal pond. And just as remarkable are the dolomite ooids, concentric layers of dolomite that have accreted around a quartz or feldspar sand grain. These dolomite ooids seem to be exclusively found in the cross-bedded portions of the upper part of the Coconino. And their discovery is significant because ooids are thought to form exclusively in marine settings. They're typically associated with coastal or tidal environments such as beaches. So the presence of dolomite ooids in the Coconino crossbeds seems to be at odds with an aeolian interpretation. Another very common claim found in the literature is that the Coconino has high-angle cross-bedding, just like that of modern desert sand dunes. In modern desert dunes, the sand builds up until it gets so steep that the sand avalanches, and that avalanching takes place at angles of about 33 degrees, known as the angle of repose. The Coconino is said to have steep cross-bedding, consistent with accumulation at the angle of repose, just like modern desert sand dunes. Well, in order to test this claim, we made measurements of Coconino crossbed dips at most locations that we visited. And in this slide, you can see our plot of over 200 measured crossbed dips from across the Coconino outcrop. Despite the claims that the Coconino has steep crossbedding, we found that the crossbed dips averaged only 20 degrees and rarely reached 30 degrees or higher. In fact, our data was consistent with a whole series of crossbed dips that were published by Reiki as long ago as 1938, which you can see in the plot here in this slide. Now, given that Reiki published these data over 80 years ago, it is very puzzling that the myth of steep crossbeds in the Coconino has managed to persist for so long. Is it possible to explain the lower than expected crossbed dips in an eolian model? One possible explanation could be that the upper parts of the Coconino sand dunes had steep crossbed dips, but that the upper parts of the dunes were eroded away when the next set of crossbeds was deposited on top. However, observations made in the field suggest that in thick sets of Coconino crossbeds, the dip angles are fairly consistent and only flatten out in the lowermost metre or so. So this doesn't seem to be a very good explanation. Others have suggested that the unexpectedly low crossbed dips in eolian sandstones might be explained by compaction of the sediment after it was deposited. But the high porosity of the Coconino, along with the absence of deformed grains, suggests that the Coconino hasn't been severely compacted. So it seems most likely that the crossbed dips currently observed in the Coconino are close to the dip angles when the sandstone was originally deposited. Another argument for an aeolian origin concerns the large sand-filled cracks at the base of the Coconino, which extend downwards into the underlying Hermit Formation in the Grand Canyon region. In 1934, Edwin McKee described these sand-filled cracks as desiccation cracks. In other words, cracks that were formed when the sediment dried out in arid conditions, and subsequent workers have tended to interpret them the same way. The idea is that after the Hermit Formation was deposited, the climate began to dry out, and large mud cracks opened up on a sun-baked floodplain. Eventually, the Coconino Desert began to advance across this arid landscape, burying the Hermit Formation and filling in the deep mud cracks with wind-blown sand. Good examples of these sand-filled cracks can be seen along the Bright Angel Trail and in many other locations around the Grand Canyon region. In this photograph, you can see the cream-coloured Coconino overlying the brown-red Hermit Formation, and you can also see the very prominent sand-filled crack extending downwards from the Coconino into the Hermit. Dr. John Whitmore has been studying these features for many years, and as part of our Coconino project, he made detailed measurements of more than 75 of these sand-filled cracks at about 30 localities. Samples were also collected from both the cracks and the Hermit Formation for petrographic study. Now, significantly, the petrographic work that was done on the Hermit samples showed that the sand-filled cracks couldn't be desiccation cracks, because the Hermit samples didn't contain the types and amounts of clay minerals that would have been needed for desiccation cracks to develop. Modern sediments that crack by desiccation contain significant amounts of clay, but our X-ray diffraction analyses showed that the Hermit contains only small amounts of clay. In other words, it simply doesn't have either the right grain size or the right mineralogy for the cracks to have formed by desiccation. Moreover, when the sand-filled cracks were plotted on a map, it became clear that the largest cracks were located alongside the greatest displacement of the Bright Angel Fault, a major tectonic feature that cuts across the Grand Canyon. Right next to the fault, some of the cracks were up to 15 metres deep, and the size of the cracks decreased to the east, to the west, and to the north, with increasing distance from the fault. This distribution strongly suggests that the sand-filled cracks are actually not desiccation cracks at all, but rather tectonic cracks caused by movement along the Bright Angel Fault. And many other features of the cracks are also consistent with a tectonic origin. including the orientation of the cracks, flow structures and broken sandstone fragments within the cracks, and horizontal sandstone lenses connected to the cracks. Now, in my talk yesterday, we looked at some examples of soft sediment deformation features with challenging implications for the conventional geological timescale, and the sandfield cracks in the Coconino provide another example. You see, in the conventional model, about 225 million years must have passed between the deposition of the Coconino and the movement along the Bright Angel Fault that caused the sand to be forcibly injected into the cracks. So the question once again is, how could the Coconino have remained soft and water saturated for 225 million years from the time of its deposition to the time that the faulting occurred? By contrast, the young age creationist model overcomes this time problem, because during the flood, these events would have closely followed one another and were not separated by such a vast length of time. One final discovery I want to talk about are the parabolic recumbent folds that we identified in the Coconino around the Sedona area of Arizona. Guy Forsyth, one of our colleagues, lives in Sedona, and during his hikes in the mountains he was able to find quite a number of these never-before-documented features. Here you can see a particularly dramatic example: a large parabolic recumbent fold in the lizard head of Capitol Butte. A recumbent fold is basically a fold that's lying on its side. In this case, the fold is nearly 7 meters thick, and it can be traced for at least 50 meters along the outcrop. In fact, some of these folded horizons probably extend over many square kilometers. Several sets of folds also occur along Bryn's Ridge near Sedona. The folded beds in this photograph are between 1 and 2 meters thick, and they can be traced for at least 400 meters along the length of the ridge and may have originally extended further than that. Now, we know that these folds must have been formed at the time the beds were deposited and not afterwards, because the folded horizons are sandwiched between sets of undeformed beds. So how were these folds formed? The folds don't resemble the kinds of folds that are formed by the downslope slumping of windblown dunes, which are typically quite small, have a more limited horizontal extent, and are quite distinctive in appearance. However, they are similar to folds known to form in water-deposited sands. Strong water currents can sometimes take freshly deposited crossbeds and flip them over to produce large recumbent folds. Folding of this kind has been observed in both modern and ancient sand deposits, and has also been produced experimentally in the laboratory. And so, in our opinion, these folds constitute one of the best pieces of evidence for the rapid underwater deposition of the Coconino Sandstone. Well, in addition to the evidences that we've looked at in this talk, there are a number of other evidences we haven't had time to cover, but all of them are consistent with the idea that the Coconino was deposited underwater. If you want to find out more about the work that we did, then do check out the various articles and papers that we've published, some of which I've listed here in this slide. We're very excited about the things that we've discovered as we've studied the Coconino Sandstone, and we're very keen to share our findings with others. Of course, this leaves an important outstanding question. If the Coconino wasn't deposited in a desert, then how was it deposited? Given its unusual features, not least its extraordinary extent, its thickness and details of its sedimentology, the Coconino doesn't quite resemble any modern depositional environment found on the surface of the Earth today. However, it does have a number of broad similarities to the large underwater sand dunes known as sand waves. Sand waves are very common features of modern nearshore and shallow marine tidal environments, where the water currents are strong and there's a steady supply of sand. Sand waves are typically asymmetrical, linear dunes, and they can reach 15 metres in height and 500 metres in wavelength. In fact, some are even larger. They're usually found in water depths of less than 100 metres, although some occur in much deeper water. And theoretical modelling and field studies indicate that their internal structure is dominated by various types of cross-bedding. Sand waves have been particularly well studied on the floor of the North Sea, for example between England and the Netherlands. Here you can see part of an echo sounder profile of 430 large sand waves off the Dutch coast that was obtained in 1964. Significantly, Johan van Veen, an engineer with the Dutch Water Authority, once said that while passing through the southern part of the North Sea with the echo machine running, one is strongly reminded of passing over a submarine desert. Here you can see an echo sounder image showing part of a very large sand wave field in eastern Long Island Sound, New York. Take note of that tiny black object on the left side of the image. That's the wreck of the Lake Hemlock, a converted World War I cargo ship that sank in 1957. That wreck is about 80 metres long, which provides something of a scale for the sand waves that you can see in this image. Now, we think that sand waves, while not exactly equivalent to the Coconino, are able to explain many features of the Coconino that are not well explained by an eolian model. The crossbed dips, the patterns of sorting and rounding, the presence of mica and dolomite, and many other features are better explained by underwater accumulation as giant sand waves than by deposition in a desert. Moreover, we think that our conclusions about the Coconino are applicable to many similar sandstones across the southwestern United States and in other parts of the world. Many of these sandstones have similar characteristics to the Coconino, including similar trackways, textural characteristics, crossbed dips, mica and dolomite. While working on the Coconino Project, we visited and sampled many of these sandstones across the southwestern United States and in Great Britain, and our study of the literature, our field observations and our examination of thin sections demonstrate that they have many similarities with the Coconino. And this brings me to one of the reasons why we think that our work on the Coconino will inevitably prove so controversial, because it raises some very challenging questions for the conventional model of Earth history. You see, according to conventional reconstructions of the Earth's geography during the Permian, the time when these sandstones were being deposited, the world's continents were joined together in a single supercontinent known as Pangaea. And because Pangaea was so large, conventional geologists think that the interior of the supercontinent would have become extremely dry and arid, with extensive deserts developing across much of the landscape. And that's why desert-deposited sandstones are so common in the Permian record, or so the story goes. But if these sandstones are not, in fact, desert sandstones, but were actually deposited by powerful ocean currents sweeping across the continents, then we have to ask a radical question. Was the supercontinent Pangaea actually underwater? And of course, that begins to sound rather like a worldwide flood. So our conclusions will almost certainly continue to be resisted by uniformitarian geologists, even if they think our basic observational data is sound. So to summarise as we draw to a conclusion, the Coconino Sandstone and its lateral equivalents form an extensive blanket of sand that stretches from California to North Dakota and from Texas to Idaho. The data that we've gathered and published indicates that there are many common misconceptions about the Coconino Sandstone, including its grain roundness and sorting, grain frosting, mineralogy, and angle of crossbed dips. The data do not support the idea that it was deposited in an aeolian environment, but rather point to an underwater origin. Although there are no precise modern analogues for the Coconino Sandstone, we think that the Coconino was deposited as a series of gigantic submarine sand waves that were migrating rapidly across the submerged continents during the worldwide flood under the influence of very powerful currents. We think that our research provides a good example of how young-age creationism can help us to ask good questions, to make significant new discoveries, as well as helping us to respond to geological challenges. And finally, the results of our research remind us to be skeptical of the skeptics and to put into practice the biblical admonition to test all things and to hold on to that which is good. I want to acknowledge and thank the Institute for Creation Research, Calgary Rock and Materials, Cedarville University, and Biblical Creation Trust, all of whom supported the Coconino Project in so many ways.